I think the worst euphemism that I can think of is U.S. intervention. And I want to talk about like what that means and how that's connected to the huge influx of Latin American immigrants that have come in the last like half century or so. So starting with some examples, in Guatemala, before 1944, the country was ruled by a dictator, Ubico. And at this time, United Fruit, which is a U.S. company, now it's called Chiquita, it owned 42% of all land in Guatemala. One company, one U.S. company. And it didn't have to pay very much in taxes or import duties, so a great deal. 77% of all Guatemalan exports went to the United States, and 65% of imports came from the United States. So it was basically a colony of the United States through one company, United Fruit. United Fruit also owned the country's telephone and telegraph system. It was nicknamed El Pulpo by actual Guatemalans because it means the octopus because it just owned everything, right? Until the 1944 Guatemalan Revolution, which kicked Ubico out and elected Arevalo, a liberal. And then in 1951, they elected Arbenz, a socialist, who brought communists into the government. His Decree 900 gave idle land that United Fruit wasn't even using, to farmers, which is really bad for United Fruit, who were using only 8% of the land that they owned. Arbenz seized 40% of that land, paid its market value, which, by the way, was deflated because of United Fruit's deals, right? So this is really bad for U.S. big business, which is fused with the U.S. state in the age of imperialism. Eisenhower was president at this time, and he did not want to directly intervene in Guatemala. And this is what intervening means. Instead, he had the CIA train mercenaries to sabotage Arbenz secretly, which, by the way, a democratically elected government thrown up by a revolution, and installed their own guy, Armas. And how it worked, the U.S. sent 150 people to make Guatemalans believe that they're being invaded by a greater force and just scare them. So the U.S. bombed Guatemala City. Innocent people died in this. Broadcast propaganda messages on the radio, and they used spies to undermine Arbenz's authority with his own supporters. And all of this was in secret, even to Arbenz, who asked the U.S. for help. He resigned and fled Guatemala, and the CIA replaced him with their guy. Next example, El Salvador. In 1932, there were mass uprisings against the U.S.-friendly government. The U.S. sent arms to that government to fight back, and they killed 30,000 people. Aid continued under the 70s to this right-wing government and increased under Reagan in the 80s, despite these symbolic checks by Congress where this horrible violence continued. And in the Civil War in El Salvador, 1979 to 92, this was a revolution against that U.S.-friendly regime to finally kick it out. The U.S. funded that right-wing government to fight back $1 or $2 million a day. It includes funding and training death squads to keep them in power. These people, they kidnapped, tortured, murdered left-wingers. They decapitated them with guillotines. And then they used meat-packing plants to dispose of the remains. This is why I say U.S. intervention is the worst euphemism. The tactic against these left-wingers was called draining the sea, another great euphemism, because, these people, this revolutionary forces, they had mass support. So fighting the revolutionaries meant fighting ordinary El Salvadorians. In this scorched earth policy, they raped, they pillaged, they massacred entire villages. One called El Mozote, explicitly including its children, these troops were told. Kill all the children to serve as a bloody example to the rest. Over the whole of this war, Reagan spent about $1 billion in total, and that's a lot for this time, right, on military aid for the government just during the administration. 1 million people out of 6 million were displaced because their homes were destroyed. So where are they going to go, right? Lots of them went to the U.S., and as for how many people died, it's hard to say because this isn't recorded. This is secret, right? At least 70,000, probably more, right? So lots more. There are endless more examples of this. There's Nicaragua. I don't know, I have more listed here, but not even in Latin America, but all over the world. The Greek Civil War was crushed because of U.S. intervention. But what's the common thread here? What's the point? The U.S. imperialism creates the conditions that force immigrants to leave, to people to immigrate, right? Over and over, the US, they overthrow these revolutionary movements by funding right-wing regimes to crush them. And why do they do this? Because they have business interests. And what does that mean? It means access to raw materials at a good deal. It means cheap land. It means a good place to export both products and capital to make money on interest, right? And cheap labor to make products cheaply. And that's what we're talking about when we say sphere of influence. It's access to all these things. Just in like quick facts and figures, in 1935, almost 100 years ago, half of all U.S. steel and cotton exports were sold in Latin America. Extremely good market, right? Because the U.S. markets couldn't absorb these things. And between just 1950 and 1965, U.S. corporations invested $3.8 billion in Latin America and made $11.2 billion in profits. And compare that to Europe, they actually lost money in Europe. Another one, 1991, Grenada had 118 offshore banks on its lands. That's 1 in 64 every 64 Guatemalans gets a bank, right? I mean, not really for them. But all this is for laundering, tax evasion, fraud, increasing profits, right? So that's what it means that when that Latin America is America's backyard. And currently it's losing it, right? That's what it means. It means high stakes, extremely profitable investment that the imperialists are willing to defend with violence, with rape, with pillaging, because to not have them means being confined to the US and going under. You can't have capitalism in one country. That's what imperialism is about, right? And so what do revolution in these countries mean? It means nationalization, expropriation from U.S. business interests. It means losing their huge empire, right? That means Chiquita and Anaconda Copper, International Telephone and Telegraph, who gave $1 million to crush Allende in Chile directly, losing their billions in super profits. The point is, since 1965, half of all immigrants to America have been from Latin America. That's over 35 million people. Is it any wonder why these people leave? When the U.S. imperialists are causing all this horrible violence, they're destroying their homes, right? It's capitalism that forces people to immigrate.
The Revolutionary Communists of America are excited to announce a new book by our comrade John Peterson titled Colossus, The Rise and Decline of U.S. Imperialism. It isn't enough to hate imperialism. In order to defeat it, we need to understand it. This book looks at the history of U.S. imperialism, and just like Lenin's book on the highest stage of capitalism, uses facts and figures to grasp the basic features of imperialism. Pre-order the book now in the description below.